Never-ending queues, scattered protests, the country with the world's largest oil reserves has no fuel. So say the headlines in Venezuelan and international outlets. But while the mainstream media is more than happy to exploit the consequences of fuel shortages to push US foreign policy goals, it is not as dedicated when it comes to analyzing the root causes. Let's take a closer look at the causes and consequences of fuel shortages in Venezuela. US sanctions. There is no aspect of Venezuelan lives that is not hurt by US unilateral coercive measures, commonly known as sanctions. In the past 6 years, the US Treasury Department has launched successive attacks against the Caribbean country's oil industry. Its main goal is to sow chaos with the shortage of gasoline and diesel. In the past few months alone, Washington has forbidden the export of fuel refining diluents to Venezuela, threatened multinational companies with sanctions to stop them from selling fuel to the Maduro government, threatened secondary sanctions against companies doing crude for fuel swap deals with state oil company PDVSA, seized fuel tankers headed for Venezuela in international waters. As a result, the fuel shortages that were becoming prevalent in the interior of the country finally reached the capital and surrounding areas. Oil industry decay. Hard hit by sanctions and internal mismanagement problems, crude output fell from 1.9 million barrels per day in August 2017, when the first sanctions against PDVSA were levied, to a mere 380,000 in September 2020. With such low production levels, there is less crude to refine into gasoline or diesel. To make matters worse, sanctions and mismanagement are far from being the only issues affecting PDVSA. In recent years, the company has suffered from a brain drain, resulting in a severe drop in qualified personnel amidst this difficult scenario. A lack of maintenance, which has seen infrastructure deteriorate and more accidents take place. Acts of sabotage from opposition sectors. Corruption. According to the Attorney General's office itself, there are more than 100 PDVSA officials currently under investigation. Paralyzed refineries. Venezuela has a large-scale refining industry and the largest refining complex in the hemisphere. The Paraguaná refining complex in Falcon State has a capacity to process over 900,000 daily barrels. Nevertheless, the industry never developed its technological independence, and under the weight of sanctions, it gradually ground to a halt. In recent months, with support from Iran, El Palito and Cardón refineries have been reactivated. But the process has been marred by setbacks with frequent fires, spills, and incidents that have forced a halt in operations. Even so, the refineries are operating far below capacity and well short of meeting the current demand of around 50,000 barrels per day. This number itself is well below the normal demand of 200,000 barrels per day before the COVID-19 quarantine. Iran has also provided support with several fuel shipments, which have provided moments of respite for the country. Tehran likewise recently sent 500,000 barrels of condensate needed to blend Venezuela's extra heavy crude. The consequences. Fuel shortages have devastating consequences for the Venezuelan people. If on a global scale it paralyzes the economy on a day-to-day basis, this implies a generalized lack of transportation. As a result, crops are lost, sick people can't make it to the hospital, and industries operate in a stop-start fashion. Another important effect is the widespread desperation for those who have to queue for hours or even days with no assurances that they will be able to fill their tanks. At the same time, corrupt practices flourish, either hidden or in broad daylight. Those who have control over this scarce resource, from local officials to security forces watching over the pumps, sell fuel to the highest bidder. The ever more scarce and expensive fuel is then reflected in the growing costs of goods and services, stretching the already strained Venezuelan incomes even more. The liberal response. For its part, the Venezuelan government has reacted to this problem and the crisis in the same way, granting more and more privileges to the private capital, both national and foreign. In the case of fuel, private operators were granted concessions to run fuel pumps and allowed to set increasingly arbitrary prices, as well as charge in foreign currency. As a result, injustices and inequality gradually worsen. In the same vein, the recently approved anti-blockade law looks to offer better conditions and protection for private investment in the country's strategic sectors. However, this rightward shift has caused heated debates inside Chavismo. Critical sectors argue that this path has made matters worse and warn that the US blockade can become an excuse for very profitable opportunities for big business and sectors close to the government. Unable to trigger the desired regime change, Washington has progressively tightened the noose. The goal is to sink the Venezuelan economy for good by depriving it of the fuel it needs to run. Will the government's reforms favoring private investment generate adequate solutions? Or is it time to consider more revolutionary measures?